Don't believe what you're seeing. No one loves this man. In fact, you might wonder whether anyone ever loved him. After a 20-year struggle, he's finally been elected President of the United States. This is the face of a man delighted with his accession to power, overjoyed at having finally reached his goal after so many setbacks. Like all stories with unhappy endings, that's where it all begins, at the end.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
In 1968, he stood for president as the new Nixon, a man who wanted peace in Vietnam, a man on the side of those other Americans who'd had enough of seeing the children of the well-off dodge the draft. He was so sure of himself that he didn't notice the shadow of the old Nixon resurfacing with a score to settle. The Watergate scandal ruined his presidency and forced him to resign. He became once again the man everyone loved to hate. You cannot understand this man without knowing the story of his rise to power. This story began in 1952 at the Republican Party convention in Chicago. There he is. He's 39 years old and has just been nominated a candidate for the vice presidency under Eisenhower, the hero of the D-Day landings in France. Like a boxer's manager, he raises the hand of the nation's hero. And it works. This man, still unknown to the public at large, is Richard Nixon. Dick to his friends. Richard Nixon was a brilliant lawyer. He was elected a Republican representative of California in 1946, seeing himself as the champion of the farmers, employees, and laborers of that other America, the America from which he himself came. His political baptism came with the Cold War, a war waged by America against the Soviet Union, but mostly against itself. From 1946 onwards, the fear of communism sparked a series of investigations against the enemy within. A committee was set up to investigate and pass judgment. The witch hunt had begun.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Yes, sir. Or have you ever been a member of the
Richard Nixon sensed that there was a role for him in this scenario, and he knew what it might be.
You have to stop.
I want to know their name. You feel that if you had seen that picture?
No, Mark.
Were you or were you not?
This particular case was like the plot of a film noir, with a high-level Democrat civil servant, Alger Hiss, accused of spying for the Soviet Union.
Because in dealing with people charged with being communists, over a period of years we have found that
Hiss belonged to that intelligentsia despised by Nixon's electors.
Dodge the question or deliberately lie. We know that we cannot get the records of the Communist Party.
Suspicions of treason, a few lies and a repentant accomplice. Nixon stepped into the breach and the Hiss affair was launched.
I am holding in my hand a microfilm of very highly confidential, secret State Department documents. These documents were fed out of the State Department over 10 years ago by communists who were employees of that department and who were interested in seeing that these documents were sent to the Soviet Union.
Nixon's inquisition would last 2 years. The whole country followed the revelations and developments of this real-life thriller with bated breath. Nixon played the part of the implacable prosecutor, and what did it matter whether the accused was guilty or not? The message was that from the ranks of the Republicans came a man who could restore order and protect the country's freedoms. The man's name was Dick Nixon. He secured his conviction and became the hero of Republican electors. His career took another turn. He became a senator and would never tire of mentioning Hiss, knowing only too well that he owed his success to that affair. It was at the same time, too, that he earned his nickname of Tricky Dicky. To fight the enemies of America, of course, you could use any means, even the most underhand. Thus it was that Nixon ended up at General Eisenhower's side, fighting the campaign for the presidency of the United States.
I accept your summons. I will lead this crusade.
Nixon was without doubt the best choice in his party. General Eisenhower was a political novice and needed a man who could help him beat the Truman administration. He left the choice of arms to Nixon himself, just so long as he was not tainted. Nixon kept everyone guessing right up to the last minute.
Candidate for the vice presidency. Would you comment on that, sir? Well, all that I can say is that when I read this news for the first time tomorrow in a story which appeared in Chicago Daily News, that it was the first time I've heard of it, and I assume it'll probably be the last that I'll hear of it.
I wish to say to you that I know...
In front of the cameras, he continued to deny his candidacy. Yet the decision had been made a long time before.
Than my junior colleague, Senator Richard Nixon of California.
He was nominated by acclamation. And it was only then that his wife, Pat, learned that he was standing. The blow had her reeling as the Republican gathering chose her husband. She hadn't wanted him to stand. They had argued all night about it, and only a few minutes before his nomination, he was still denying his candidacy. Despite all this, Dick asked Pat to step up to the lectern with him and smile for the cameras. From that day on till the day she died, she never let that sad and obliging smile slip. Pat, the orphan and teacher who brought herself up alone. And he, the son of a shopkeeper, a brilliant orator, who through sheer hard work and determination had become a lawyer. Following his nomination, Senator Nixon became a celebrity. But his mother was still there to remind him of his roots. A middle-class background on the West Coast, not far from Los Angeles. His father kept a gas station cum drugstore on the outskirts of a small town to which his pals would come at the weekend for a last drink, but would never invite the shopkeeper's son to join them. While at college, Dick founded a fraternity called the Orthogonians to compete with the sons of the rich, the Franklins.
Are you on his payroll?
The two candidates launched their campaign across the country. On behalf of the millions of unimportant white people that he represented, Nixon denounced the wastefulness of the administration in Washington and attacked his Democrat counterpart, Stevenson, for being soft on communists. Such accusations always served him well. The fight back, the revenge of the Franklins, would not be long in coming. Nixon was accused of keeping a slush fund. On the 18th of September 1952, the New York Post broke the story, which grew hourly. At first, he was lining his pockets with campaign funds. Soon, it had become a hidden fortune. Eisenhower was informed several hours before a political meeting. Surprised and disturbed by the revelations, he played it tight-lipped before his public.
Knowing Dick Nixon as I do, I believe that when the facts are known to all of us, they will show that Dick Nixon would not compromise with what is right.
Eisenhower realized the damage that these allegations could do. The outcry dealt his staff a heavy blow, and the Democrats were already denouncing the hypocrisy of the Republicans for taking the moral high ground in their campaign. Nixon understood that if it was deemed necessary for Eisenhower's victory, he could easily become expendable. The next day, Ike demanded him to explain himself to the American public on television. It was a heated phone conversation, and Nixon hung up in anger. The Republicans bought a half hour of TV time for Tuesday, 23rd September on NBC. Before flying to the TV studios in Los Angeles, the candidate's advisors asked him over the phone to announce that he would step down. He refused. On the flight, he carefully reviewed his list of arguments, like the battling lawyer that he was. Only now, he was defending himself. He was, in fact, pleading for his career. Hadn't anyone noticed that Richard Nixon, though reviled by the press and even abandoned by his own party, had become indispensable to the voters of that other America, and would be very difficult to get rid of? His speech would be broadcast across the nation. 5 minutes before going on air, as he was rereading his notes, one of Eisenhower's advisors urged him yet again to announce his resignation.
The program is sponsored by the New York State Republican Committee to present Senator Richard M. Nixon.
My fellow Americans, I'm sure that you have read the charge and you've heard it, that I, Senator Nixon, took $18,000 from a group of my supporters. Not 1 cent of the $18,000 ever went to me for my personal use. Every penny of it was used to pay for political expenses. Do you think that when I or any other senator makes a political...
At a meeting in Cleveland, Eisenhower and Mamie, his wife, watched the televised defense along with 60 million other Americans.
Do you think, for example,
his speech induced nausea among his enemies, but the phone lines were jammed with calls from Americans supporting Nixon.
I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything. One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep him.
Barely had Nixon finished his speech before the Republicans of Cleveland reacted.
We want to take the vote. All those in favor of Nixon continuing as a candidate will say aye.
But despite the enthusiasm of his supporters, Eisenhower was not yet ready to express an opinion. At the lectern, he took no risks.
It is obvious that I have to have something more than one single presentation, necessarily limited to 30 minutes of the time allowed Senator Nixon. What I am going to do is to ask Senator Nixon to come to see me.
He summoned Nixon to join him at the next stage of his campaign in Wheeling, West Virginia. Pat, stunned at having seen her private life thus put on show, urged Dick to fight.
I'm not going to allow any future smears or attacks to divert me from the great issues of this campaign. And I want all of the American people to know that, as far as I'm concerned, we've just begun to fight.
The following day, Eisenhower held off his meeting in order to greet his partner. As the hours passed, he watched the support for Nixon grow and realized that he now had to defend him openly. At 8 p.m., Eisenhower met Nixon as he left his plane, and taking him in his arms said, "Dick, you're my boy."
My colleague in this political campaign has been subject to a very unfair and vicious attack. He acted as a man of courage and of honor, and so far as I am concerned, stands higher than ever before.
I want you to know that it's probably the greatest moment of my life tonight. The man that I think will make the greatest president we've had in many, many years has stood before this audience and has said, we're going to stand together in this fight for the principles in which all Americans believe. And what is good for America, believe me, is good for you. Thank you.
The crisis had passed. "20 years later, in his memoirs, Nixon spoke bitterly of this period of his career. He survived, but the ordeal weakened him. His Democrat adversary, Adlai Stevenson, was also accused of keeping a slush fund, but no one showed any interest in that. It was then that Nixon realized that he had become the man everyone loved to hate. He conducted his campaign driven by a strong desire for vengeance. He spoke to the voters whose sons were fighting in Korea and who wanted to see them brought home.
Who is the forgotten man today? He's your boy or the boy next door who's fighting in Korea. There are 500,000 boys fighting in Korea today, and they have never had it so bad. And the great issue of this campaign is...
His words were all the more effective since the whole country lived in fear of a nuclear attack from the East. And Nixon's arguments were designed to increase it. On 19th November 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected President of the United States. To a large extent, he owed his victory to Richard Nixon, who became his vice president. But at the time, the vice presidency was a mostly symbolic position, one without any future. Certainly not the kind of future shown in these pictures shot years later. Nixon was anxious not to disappoint those closest to him, and to play this, his first role, well. Who would have been most pleased at his election? Certainly not Pat, who expected that fate would eventually make him pay for all this good fortune. Probably Hannah Nixon, his mother, a Quaker whom he nicknamed the Saint. In the meantime, however, this election was yet another victory over the rich kids of his youth. Accompanied by Pat and their two daughters, Dick Nixon enjoyed his last holiday. In Washington, Nixon had no social life. No weekends off, no trips to the cinema, or dinners in town, which made him uncomfortable. He lived in Spring Valley, a Washington suburb, and devoted his days to work.
One of the great things about my staff is it's you.
At the White House, Eisenhower formed a cabinet of businessmen in whose capable hands he could leave the good running of the country. In this year, 1953, the conflict in Korea was not yet over, and the Cold War had made America the guardian of the so-called free world. Nixon was one of the few politicians in this government, and he was given the task of representing the president abroad. The new vice president willingly took responsibility for foreign affairs, and his travels began. His future foreign policy as the President of the United States, being played out in these archives, would be forged during these travels, much of it the result of his first trip to Southeast Asia. He knew every line of his favorite film, Around the World in 80 Days. Like Phileas Fogg, the hero of Jules Verne's novel, he saw himself as an enlightened explorer, with a willing ear for the various peoples he encountered. A sort of pioneer, doing all the groundwork in far-off, isolated places. He witnessed the death throes of the French presence in Indochina, and was one of those who favored using the atomic bomb to save Dien Bien Phu. Nixon foresaw that this would become the theater of the fight against communism, and that once the French left, American GIs would have to take over sooner or later. It was the beginning of a special relationship between Nixon and Vietnam. Nixon wasn't born to the aristocracy. He was a self-made man. Unlike other American politicians from the ranks of high society, he had to learn it all from scratch. The dress code, the unspoken rules, the networking. He also learned to play golf in an attempt to infiltrate the president's inner circle. His character came across as fickle and unsure. He seemed to float in his baggy trousers, the waist worn high like Fred Astaire. His face and movements didn't seem to go together. He looked like a caricature. The camera lens is pitiless, like a magnifying glass, and it was America as a whole that was peering through it at Nixon. He looked like nothing as much as those disenchanted Americans that he represented. Those who fought the nation's wars, worked hard, and to whom he owed his legitimacy. His private discussions with the president were few and far between. Nixon complained about being left out. His dream, he confessed to a friend, would be to eavesdrop on Eisenhower's private conversations. What did the president think of him?
I wouldn't be doing it. I wouldn't be going through this unless...
Ironically, it was Eisenhower who was listening in on Nixon.
But I think there's a good chance.
Each one of their phone conversations was recorded because Ike didn't trust Dick. The transcriptions of several of these show to what extent the two of them disagreed. As Eisenhower brutally put it, you need to keep a record when you're talking to someone so untrustworthy.
How are the Eagles going to do next? I heard all those tales about the successive.
Nixon was being kept under close watch, and the pressure was starting to get to him. The 1956 presidential elections were fast approaching, and the idea of another campaign depressed him. He told those in his entourage that he wouldn't be standing again for the post of vice president. For the president himself, Nixon had become an albatross around his neck that he would have been only too glad to get rid of. An unforeseen event, however, changed his plans. On 24 September 1955, Washington was in the grip of a stifling Indian summer when, late in the afternoon, Nixon was informed that the president had suffered a heart attack at his home in Denver. As stipulated in the Constitution, Nixon's duty was to stand in for the sick president. His enemies described him as being at a complete loss. For the next 24 hours, he said nothing. Finally, on the Sunday morning, he appeared before the gathered journalists on his way out of church. One cannot help wondering what prayers he'd been offering up that morning. Returning to his home he had deserted the previous night, he took refuge behind appropriate platitudes.
The only comment that I want to make is to express the concern that I share with all of the American people for the early and complete recovery of the president. The American people can be assured that the business of government will go ahead as usual despite the president's illness.
In the Oval Office, he symbolically left Eisenhower's place unoccupied. Never had he been so close to the supreme power he had coveted for so long. He didn't so much chair the debate as simply let the various secretaries of state take their turns speaking. He was loath to jump the gun, and in particular, to raise the possibility of a succession. But what if Ike didn't recover? Was he moved, disappointed, or relieved to welcome Eisenhower back to Washington?
Mr. President, just a small indication of the joy and inspiration your return to Washington has brought to the people of the United States and people throughout the world. Welcome back, and Godspeed in the days ahead.
Dick seemed resigned as all his hopes faded. The president would more than likely stand again. The people seemed reassured that their old leader was still there to protect them. Nixon dreaded the coming elections, yet the foreign press seemed to appreciate the work he'd done, claiming that he had created a true role for the vice president. Who could tell what 1956 would bring?
Pure butter for the week, a tot of 2 ounces. They can still buy a combined butter-margarine total of 6 ounces. One little news item that has to come that just appeared in the press.
On 9th January 1956, Dick was 43 years old. The previous night, Ike summoned him to the White House, where he suggested that Nixon retrace a step or two of his career, by returning to the Senate, for example. It was a bitter pill for Nixon to swallow. He hadn't seen the blow coming, but now he understood that the president wanted him out of the official photo, giving up the role he could have played. However, Nixon decided to fight, and set his sights on the next election but one, in 1960. Nixon was a poker player, and he knew when to bluff. After a long silence, he judged that the time was right to give fate a bit of a push. He requested an audience with the president and announced his wish to share the ticket with Eisenhower. Caught unawares, Eisenhower accepted. He had no alternative but to retain this man, whom in private he called a loser.
I met with the president this afternoon in the White House, and at that time I informed him that in the event that he decided that it would be in the best interests of the party for me to continue in my present office,
that I would be honored to accept renomination as the Republican candidate for Vice President.
The President has asked me to say that he was delighted to hear of the Vice President's decision.
At the San Francisco Republican Convention in August, everything was still up for grabs. The president's entourage, worried about backing a losing partnership, wanted to keep Nixon out. Dick wasn't even at the convention. Officially, he was at his ailing father's bedside. But was this new show of affection merely another maneuver?
Well, my dad is tremendously interested in politics. Consequently, he, as you can imagine, he's followed this convention very closely. So when I went in, I deliberately tried to bring up the political questions because the doctor said that would stimulate him and keep him from dropping off into the coma, which could be fatal.
His absence from the convention did not go unnoticed. Whether it was out of compassion for his distress or not, the conspiracy to oust him fizzled out. Nixon learned of his nomination on television. His plan had worked.
We have just heard the proceedings of the Republican National Convention up in San Francisco. And, of course, we were very gratified by the results of the convention. Mrs. Nixon, well, she realizes that this means for her a tremendously hard schedule for the next 2 months, being away from our girls, and, of course, the responsibilities in the 4 years to come. Of course, we were very gratified.
When he'd first proposed to Pat, he'd spoken to her of what fate held in store, of the great things they would achieve together. At the time, she hadn't realized that it was a political speech, rather than a declaration of love. Once nominated, he left his father's house and hurried to the convention to make his acceptance speech. One week later, his father died, content in the knowledge of his son's nomination. Throughout his campaign, he would play the emotion card, disgusting his opponents while delighting his supporters. He'd mention his father in every speech, letting it be understood that the old man had a special fondness for whatever town he happened to be in that day. Eisenhower triumphed once again, and Nixon with him. The future looked very bright.
Renominating President Eisenhower.
Nixon had been warned of how the role of vice president was one with no future. But thanks to his hard work on the international scene, he could now aim for an election to the Supreme Office in 1960. He'd worked hard, fought and taken the blows, and now he had a few years in which to compose his presidential persona. He extended a helping hand to Hungarian refugees from the Budapest uprising, a revolt which the Americans had initially encouraged before they turned and looked the other way. In Venezuela, he bravely confronted a wild mob protesting against American imperialism and left Caracas under a hail of Molotov cocktails. In Moscow, he stood up to the Soviet leaders with resolution, but also humor. There was no doubt that Nixon was Eisenhower's legitimate heir, and he was fully confident that America would elect him president in 1960. The 1950s drew to a close. The American way of life spread to Europe, with communism contained behind the Iron Curtain. In America, a more comfortably off middle class was consuming more, enjoying more leisure time, and producing children. The country was no longer afraid of the future. Nixon, too, rode this new wave of confidence. But had he noticed how much America had changed? Did Richard Nixon expect that in November 1960 he would have to stand against one of the rare figures of the establishment for whom he had some esteem? They took a liking to each other from the very first time they met. Yet they each represented a very different part of that America they both wanted. Kennedy thought the presidency should be his by right, whereas Nixon believed he had earned it. He had worked long and hard, and now he expected his reward. The clash was between an America in black and white and one in technicolor.
That little boy manner he has, very innocent. He said, if I'm elected president, I'll consult with President Eisenhower about how to stop this slump.
Mr. Eisenhower dragged him in twice, but they're not going to drag him in a third time.
He'll have a chance to consult with Eisenhower, but he'll be a senator of the United States and not president of the United States.
If we can send him back to California for 4 more years and study up, we're going to make a good public servant out of him.
I am sick and tired of hearing my opponent run down the President of the United States and his administration.
I don't care if Abbott Lodge and Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater all prop him up and push him forward.
After he hits him below the belt, he says, oh, I didn't do it. I didn't mean Eisenhower. I meant Nixon.
The Vice President of the United States says that he will go to Eastern Europe if he wins this election. I will go to Washington, D.C. David, will you hit the 1 minute switch, please?
Right. Good.
Nixon reverted to his old anti-communist rhetoric, striking powerful blows in what he intended to be an aggressive campaign. Kennedy proved to be just as intransigent with communism, but he adopted a more conciliatory tone to address this more relaxed nation. America had laid its old demons to rest, but Nixon hadn't noticed.
Can we clear the shot now? Will everybody just move back, please?
On the radio, he seemed to win the debates, but on television, he became the gaunt, ill-shaven loser that everyone remembers.
Major candidates for the presidency: the Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
It is a pleasure to be here tonight and to participate in this program.
At the end of the night, Richard Nixon's career was decided by only 34,000 votes. The difference between the two candidates was in the order of only 0.2%. A life's ambition crumbled into dust. Right up until the end, Nixon had been the leader. The votes from Chicago were decisive, and it's now known that the Kennedys bought that result. The Kennedy legend was up and running. Here was a Franklin ready to take revenge for the rough ride Nixon had given his class for the last 10 years. Jack beat Dick, and Jackie beat Pat.
If the present trend continues, if Mr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, will be the next president of the United States. I want Senator Kennedy to know.
Despite it being the most tragic day of her life, Pat forced herself to remain calm. She looked like a woman suffering from some incurable disease, but putting on a brave face. She knew that she would have to endure Dick's despair that evening, and it was not a prospect to relish. For his part, he promised to give up politics and move back to California. He would just stand for governor in 1962.
What I was not thinking about.
Accompanied by their two daughters, Patricia and Julie, the couple left Washington, heading for a new life.
Richard Nixon and his family have finally and officially come home. From the looks of the luggage and the waybills, they have returned lock, stock, and Checkers the dog.
Well, now, wait a minute, Freddie. Just a second. What do you want? They like everything. All right, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Dick would be a lawyer again and live in Beverly Hills. But was he truly cured of politics? His standing for governor of California proved that he wasn't.
Oh, just a back-breaking job of packing.
He was soundly beaten, confirming that the voters really didn't like this man and wanted no more to do with him. Many celebrated his defeat, no doubt seeing 1962 as the year that definitively put an end to his political career.
As I leave you, I want you to know, just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
He no longer snarled at the press. Although their shared history now seemed to be over, the journalists still remained vigilant, ready to pounce on his slightest slip-up. Nixon seemed to be a man of the past. What role could he play in this new America which had moved on and left him behind, and whose future was apparently with the Democrats? The Bay of Pigs, the Berlin War, Martin Luther King, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Johnson's presidency. He had now moved to New York, running a legal practice and also traveling a lot. He was biding his time. From his early days, he had known that Southeast Asia would become an increasingly important issue for future elections. Both Kennedy and Johnson were sucked into its morass. Once again, it was young working-class Americans who were dying far from home, and discontent was growing. The war against communism was making the headlines again, and Nixon saw an opportunity to be seized.
The United States cannot afford any further concessions, any further neutralization, call it what you will, in this part of the world. What is needed now is a firm stand for freedom. If we are firm and if we are consistent, we will win. If we aren't, then the tide of the future will be with the communists.
Who better than he could find the right words to touch the heart of America? The year was 1967, and Nixon for President committees started to appear. His team watched footage of their candidate taken throughout his career. They noted his shady looks, like a poker player or a bad guy in a film noir. His arrogance and his aggressive rhetoric, like a public prosecutor attacking detractors.
This is a time for greatness.
None of this was likely to inspire people to vote for him. So they decided to change him, to create a new version of the man, a new Nixon, adapted to this new era.
Of course, I have changed. I'm older, I'm 55, and of course I'm more experienced. I know more. I won't make as many mistakes as I might have made had I been elected in 1960. Of course, others discover that I perhaps have a sense of humor, which I think I've always had, but perhaps people didn't see it. I am really the most difficult man in the world when it comes to a so-called public relations firm. Nobody's going to make me put on an act for television. I'm not going to engage in any gimmicks or any stunts, wear any silly hats, and I'm going to continue to play that role. If people looking at me say that's a new Nixon, then all that I can say is, well, maybe you didn't know the old Nixon. But so that you know who we are, I think you will know Pat, my wife, of course. This is Julie, and this is Patricia. And we'll be delighted to meet all of you. We hope you can all stay.
Doubts about his candidacy were soon dispelled. His wife, Pat, realizing that he'd been preparing for this election since his defeat in 1960, said yes.
Good. It's Patricia. Hello, Julie and I went to camping. Oh, really well.
She learned how to press the flesh like a true professional. Thousands and thousands of handshakes at a carefully measured rhythm. For could his family survive another defeat? For this presidential election, fate would once again put him up against a Kennedy. Bobby this time. Both made ending the war in Vietnam an election issue. But whereas Bobby advocated an honorable retreat while extending the hand of friendship to the Vietnamese communists, Nixon would only consider negotiating from a position of strength. Victory first. Bobby Kennedy's tragic death in June 1968 cleared the way for Richard Nixon's presidency. He added a new twist to his campaign, promising peace in Vietnam and giving hope to millions of families. Nixon was clearly prepared to go to any lengths to finally occupy the White House, 8 years after his first failed attempt. A few weeks later, in Miami, he was nominated as the Republican Party's presidential candidate. Everyone was impatient to hear whether he really had changed. Was he really this new Nixon they had been promised? More virtuous? More civilized? Presidential material?
Often people can't understand why it is that a man get into politics after suffering a defeat. And I just want to say this, I've won a few and I've lost a few, and winning's a lot more fun. I want to say, too, that the most important thing, though, to bear in mind is to get into the fight. Every one of you who has gotten into this campaign, and who will be in it between now and November, believe me, you're going to have action and you're going to have passion. I think we're going to win.
In fact, the new Nixon was more like a grinning old boxing trainer, celebrating the victory of a promising youngster in a tough fight. You had the sense that, yes, he had suffered, but that he'd overcome his ordeals. In November 1968, Nixon beat Vice President Hubert Humphrey by a narrow margin. His anti-communist rhetoric led him to intensify the bombing of North Vietnam. Victory before negotiations. Student protests increased and spilled over into American towns. And neither rapprochement with China nor the return of GIs calmed the unrest. Nixon plunged into paranoia, interpreting the discontent as the reappearance of the old communist sympathizers. And of course, to fight the enemies of America, you could use any means, even the most underhand. The old Nixon caught up with the new and brought about his downfall. He finally left the White House in August 1974.